Hello and welcome to Nothing Exempt. Today, this is a special show. I'm Brian Piotr, and I'm here with my co-host Nicholas Pardini. We were supposed to have an interview with Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, and unfortunately, I couldn't make it, so Nick did it without me. So before we get started, we just wanted to go over the show and give me a chance to say what I thought about it, going into it without any spoilers. And first of all, let me ask you, Nick, what was it like? Did you enjoy your interview?
Yeah, it was a good interview. I'd just like to apologize in advance for some issues to the sound quality because our main Skype recording system just didn't work given the fact that he called into the show through his cell phone and had to use some of my backup recording software, so the sound quality may be a little bit inconsistent on the volume. But otherwise, it was a good interview. Um, he was spot on about what he said about the economic and demographic changes that have um, transformed California, in my opinion, for the negative. And he was very dire, unfortunately, about the future of the state, and didn't really. And it was hard to come up with some sort of optimistic solutions.
Yeah, and as far as my commentary goes, I found myself agreeing with him completely. Especially the part where he said that high-income people or middle-income people are leaving the state, and that U-Hauls are priced out for leaving California, not for coming back. And because I left the state of California for the exact same reasons as he's pointing out, there's just proof that that's the state of California. It's going to be the rich and the poor, the people who live on the beach and the people who clean their houses and trim their lawns. That's the way it's headed.
Well, I mean, we've mentioned this before about the feudalization of California due to the extreme income inequality and the extreme in the terms of the type of jobs that are in California. They're either very high end, high skilled, high paying professions, or they're the very bottom of the wage scale. There are stuff that's in between, but most people would rather, for that wage, live someplace else due to the high cost of living.
Yep. And we would love to hear what you guys, as the listeners, thought of the show. If you can suffer through the audio problems, which I assure you we are going to try and solve, so that we're going to run into this situation where you come into somebody who can't use Skype and wants to use their cell phone and will still want to be able to record it effectively. So we're going to work on solving that problem. But if you have any commentary on the show, if you liked it or not, we'd appreciate it if you went to Nothing Exempt on Reddit, which is our subreddit, or go to Twitter at Nothing Exempt and reached out to us, gave us some feedback. If you liked the show or you think that this was a great interview, we'd appreciate it if you shared it with people, or if you go to iTunes and give us a review based on the show. So, without further ado, here is the interview with Victor Davis Hanson.
Today we have a special guest on the show today, noteworthy historian from the Hoover Institution and previously at Fresno State University, Victor Davis Hanson. It's actually a kind of a small world. Both of my parents grew up in Fresno, actually.
Oh, they did.
Yeah.
Good.
And my grandparents all lived there. And my grandma was still alive, still lives there. Actually, I go there every Thanksgiving. But the reason we have him on is because I want to talk to him about two interesting topics. The first one is about the state of California politics and California demographics, and the second about military history. But our first question is what do you think about the changing political environment in California? How has it affected the social order of the state and the economic prospects of the state?
Well, we know the symptoms, and that is that about a third of the budget that used to be spent on infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, canals, aqueducts, freeways, is now spent on social programs. And by that I mean mostly Medi-Cal, state-subsidized health care. And whereas California used to be about 11% of the 11th in test scores of the 50 states, it's now about 46th. either 1 or 2 in infrastructure in the 60s. It's rated by magazines like Forbes at 49. And where it used to have about a 7th or 8th of the nation's welfare recipients, it's now got 1/3 of all welfare recipients. And where it used to have about 10% below the poverty line, it's got about 22%. So the question is, why is that? What's going on? And I think the answer is it's sort of a medieval society without a middle class. It's got the greatest wealth in the country as selected counties per capita income, or the number of billionaires, or whatever rubric you use, and it's got the greatest number of poor people. And what happened to cause that? I guess there were 3 reasons. One is we had about 12 to 15 million people come illegally across the southern border the last 30 years. And they mostly came not from northern Mexico, but from southern Mexico, Oaxaca province, especially Chiapas. And they came mostly without a high school diploma, legality, and English, so they were much harder to assimilate. They also came at a time when the salad bowl of tribalism and identity politics was in vogue, and the old melting pot was considered passé. So that meant that we had, eventually with the second generation, we had about 1/3 of the population that was in need of social services. That had not been true before. And 1 out of every 4 Californians, so that's 10 million Californians, were not born in the United States that are residing here. They were born in a different country. That was one problem, so that put a great strain on the state as far as entitlements and social services, population growth. And then we had a huge influx of great wealth, and by that I mean the market capitalization of Alphabet, Dash, Google, Apple, Facebook, Oracle, Uber, all that is about $4 trillion. It was confined in a very narrow Bay Area corridor, and then we had our universities sort of transmogrified into global universities. They were very good as far as their research programs, science and math, Caltech, Stanford, UC Berkeley, UCLA, USC. And that created a large amount of unprecedented wealth along the coastal corridor. And the result of that is that you have very, very wealthy, powerful people who have certain ideas about the environment, about energy, about taxes, who are not necessarily subject to the ramifications of their own ideology. They can navigate around how that falls upon people, and it falls mostly upon the middle class that aren't subsidized or supported, and they've left. And the third part of that equation is we've lost 4 million people over 30 years in the $50,000 to $100,000 bracket. You add it all up, we've imported a lot of poor people, we've imported some rich people, we've developed very lucrative industries, and we've lost the middle class. And the result is that we're spending, basically transfer redistributed wealth from wealthy people who can afford it, they think they can afford it, to poor people. And the people who couldn't afford it, 13% or 10% or 12% income, or 11 cents on the dollar, or sales tax, or, federal gas tax, 77 cents or whatever. They've left. They're going to Idaho, Nevada, Texas, places that don't have income taxes or very low income taxes.
So, I mean, it seems like there's a lot to pull out of that. And, I mean, I know anecdotally a lot of people who have moved to other states because of similar cost of living concerns. But the thing is that what would it take for California to be a dual-party state again? Because right now it seems to be a one-party government that runs California for the foreseeable, and will be so for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that would require the reestablishment of the middle class. So I don't think that given housing prices on the coast, or even in a state in general, you're going to attract, and the regulatory climate, it's not going to draw in middle class people. So what you're talking about is people who are in the lower middle class or poverty level, and they tend to be mostly Hispanic and poor, some poor whites in the Oklahoma diaspora. have to convince them that they are paying high taxes, and yet their schools, in terms of test scores, their gasoline prices, in terms of other states' prices, their availability to water, the power, the amount of money they pay for a kilowatt hour of electricity, or what they're paying for high-speed rail vis-a-vis what they're likely to get for it, versus the highest gas taxes in the country, and yet their commute time is one of the longest because of the quality, poor quality. You'd have to say to them, well, you may be politically progressive, but in a practical sense, this has been a disaster for you, and you better start voting your pocketbook, and that would mean promoting natural gas production in California, timber production, mining, not letting out 70% of the San Joaquin and Sacramento water flows into the bay, but using it for more agriculture. Practical things that would raise the standard of living and distribute over a wider population. And yet the Democrats are focused on identity politics, and so it sort of overshadows the economic appeals of something other than progressivism.
Okay, so my next question then is historically societies like you mentioned, where you have a kind of feudal like hierarchy where you have different cultures and different socioeconomic classes, historically tend to end up in sort of conflict. Like, what's the moment, like with California, you can see there's two possibilities. One, that because within the financial state of California, their tax revenues are heavily reliant on capital gains taxes from the sale of equity in tech companies, whether it's venture-backed startups or some of the bigger tech companies out there such as Google and Facebook. If you have a flat to down stock market where you're not getting those type of capital gains tax revenue and California comes up short, would the California ultimately have what I call a Michigan moment, where just the finances of the state force to have structural reforms, even if the ideological views of the citizens don't change?
Yeah.
Or will you have more of just like social tensions, like what's been going on recently with the yellow vests in France?
I think both. We're going to have that kind of moment in April of next year, because under the new Tax Reform Act of 1918, you can only write off on your federal income taxes $10,000 in property income and local taxes, so state taxes. So that would mean that, let's say you were a couple and one of you owned a little business and one of you was a high school administrator, and you made $250,000, $300,000, but you're living in California, so you're paying almost $1 million or $800,000 for a home, and you might have as much as $10 or $15 or $20,000 a year in property tax, and then you might be paying 13% in income tax, and that could be, say, $30,000, take a figure. So you were paying $40,000, and yet you were writing that off your federal income tax. So you're really only paying $20,000. Now you're really paying $40,000. And what that means is that couple with 3 kids is now asked to pay $20,000 more a year for the privilege of living in California, because that local tax is no longer a write-off. And that means that basically you're telling an upscale middle-class California couple, you've got to pay an $1,800 a month premium to live in this wonderful state in which your sales tax and your gas taxes are sky high, and you're getting the worst roads in the country, 49, and you're getting very poor schools for your kids, and you have a high crime, the crime rate is going up, and that's not going to appeal to a lot of people. So the question is, how many are going to leave? In a state of 40 million, it doesn't really matter how many leave. It matters what income group they leave from. And that's that's because of the 40 million people, 160,000 households pay half of all the state income tax, which is about 50% of all the revenues from the state. So just to regroup a little bit, that means you're depending on a state of 40 million people. You're depending on less than about 1/100th of the population to pay half your income tax. And if you lose 10,000 people out of 40 million that are in that category that don't want to pay $1,800 a month, or that would be the low number of those very affluent people. You can see what we're talking about. You're talking about a budget crisis coming up in April, and then the question is, what are you going to do about it? Well, the progressive mindset would say then you have to raise taxes to make up for the difference. So then the people who were there, sort of Russian roulette, would say, wait a minute, I should have left with the first group because they got out before they got hit with 15%. And so you get into a death spiral. We're just talking about income tax and subsidies in time. We're not even talking about the STIRS or PERS program that have variously $80 to $300 billion that are not funded. So I think it's not good for California and its regulatory climate, and it hasn't dealt with illegal immigration in a very honest way, an ethical way. It doesn't want to talk about it. It's not investing in infrastructure commensurate with the size of population growth. So I'm not optimistic about the state.
What do you think the timing is that they're going to be forced to become more competitive economically, or is it just these newly departed Californians are just going to bring their voting patterns with them and just make every state have the same level of taxes and regulation as California?
Yeah, I mean, that's what people say. If you're in Texas or Wyoming or Montana, they say, we're getting more liberal, but usually if you examine it, that's in terms of socially liberal, but most Californians that leave are not necessarily eager to raise taxes in Texas or Idaho. That's why they went there. And I don't think the California model is one that, or the Illinois model or the New York model is one that really appeals to a lot of people, because out-migration, when you subtract immigration, those are three of the states that are bleeding the most: New York, Illinois, and California. And just as an example, about a month ago when I wrote about this, I went into a Fresno U-Haul and I asked, I would like to get a medium-sized van from U-Haul to go to Austin, Texas, and how much would that be? It was about $2,100. Then I asked how much if I was in Austin would it cost to come to Fresno? He said $230. And he said, off the record, if you're willing to do certain things, I could probably give it to you free. In other words, their traffic is all one way. Nobody is renting moving vehicles that come into California. Our population growth is either demographic natural births or immigration from foreign countries, Asia and Mexico and Central America. And we're losing people of a particular income group, and we're getting people of a particular income group. And the calculus is more people are coming in with less money or salary or capital than the people leaving the state. So far we haven't talked about that as a state because there's been such huge wealth at the top in these Silicon Valley, high-tech, university, banking, finance along the coast. That group of people, the 10 million people that live on the coast between La Jolla all the way up to Berkeley Field, that they're willing to pay extra monies for certain benefits, the beauty of the state, the weather, and that they have enough money doesn't really affect them, and they put their kids in private schools if they have to. They have the money. But the people who were in high-impacted areas, Sacramento, Bakersfield, Fresno, a lot of them left. They didn't have the money, or they went up to the Sierra foothills. And
yeah, it seems like just with the interior corridor of the state, you don't get the benefit of the coastal climate or access to the capital of these big cities, yet you're paying the same taxes, and if you're an entrepreneur, you're facing the same business regulations without those type of benefits. So I can see why that people in the interior are migrating.
Yeah, I think there's also a sense, it's a little bit more complex, But there's a growing anger in California that if you're middle class, what's left of it, and you play by the rules, you're subject to hyper-regulation. By that I mean, if you're a teacher and one of your spouse is a small contractor and you want to put solar panels on your garage, then you expect a California county inspector will go meticulously over every aspect. There will be so many rules and regulations that the cost of installation will probably be 25% higher than another state. It will take a long time. You'll have all these green regulations, and they'll really target you. If you're in the Central Valley and you came here from, say, Salvador or Mexico, you have no money, you rented a Winnebago on rocks behind another trailer behind an old house, and you're living out in rural Fresno County where I live, and you have Romex wires strung up for the electricity, you have a porta potty for the sewage problem, and your dog's on license, there's a sense that because you were okay coming in illegally and nobody's hassled you in the sanctuary state, that you're living here illegally, that nobody's going to hassle you, that your electricity, your sewage, your water are all illegal. And so what that tells people is the rules can't be equitably applied across the board because there's too many. When you have one third of all the welfare recipients in the nation here, and you have 1/5 of residents under the poverty line, mostly due to illegal immigration, then an inspector makes a choice. Do I go inspect this guy who speaks English and follows the rules and will pay me fines and justify, or do I go across the street and talk to people who don't speak English and have no money, and there's not one or two violations I can cite, but maybe 50, and if I were to cite those and have the person arrested, I get into ICE questions and saying I don't want to do that. It's a money-losing proposition versus a money-making proposition, and the result is the law is felt to be unequal.
So what do you
when I
think?
Talk to people, people say, I got a ticket for a speed trap because California's broke. I have to pay $450, but they just gave amnesty for 77 million in traffic tickets below a particular income, and most people know it, so they don't care. And that's the attitude of cynicism that's followed. It's not healthy.
So what do you think California is going to look like in 2040?
40? Oh, I think it's going to sort of, I don't know how to say it, but it's going to be a dysfunctional society for the middle class. So I would imagine that for people who are making $300,000 and above, they're going to sort of have castle-like estates, walls around them. The kids will be in private school. I'm talking about wealthy people from Punjab or Asia or so-called white or wealthy Hispanics that are intermarried, assimilated, good government, college presidents or head of the DMV, those kind of jobs. And then there's going to be a vast underclass. And I think the middle class is going to leave. And there's always going to be somewhat of a middle class to run the 7-Eleven, the air conditioning contractors, but it's going to be very hard for those guys to make it if they follow the law. So you're going to have more of the same, that you're going to have a systematic across the board neglect of the law, and people are just not going to follow it because they don't have the money to do it, and it's kind of that way now. So if you go out to rural Tulare County or Kings County or out in Kern County and you get away from the municipal areas, you can see things that you haven't really seen in 30 or 40 years. You'll see homes that are shacks, or you'll see 20 cars piled up that are broken, or if somebody runs into your vineyard, or they'll just leave the scene of the accident. If you get in a hit and run, the person flees. And you see things that happen that haven't really happened since the 1930s or 40s. It's every man for himself.
Okay. Before we head off, as we're going over time, I wanted to ask you just briefly about your perspective as a military historian on American foreign policy. Like, what do you think the role is of American foreign policy generally, and when is it the right time to intervene in a foreign conflict?
Well, I think under the present administration, they've tried to square the circle between intervention for idealism or to replicate American values, which they're opposed to given our misadventures in Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan, versus trying to preempt problems that would haunt us later on that are in U.S. self-interest, kind of more rubble, less trouble. And by that I mean a bombing campaign with ISIS to eliminate it without worrying about sticking around and building a democracy in Syria. And so I think where we're headed is in reaction to past policies that the United States is going to pick and choose areas that are contingent upon whether they can be successful, and they can't be successful in a lot of places, and then B, whether the action or the intervention favors U.S. interest, but they're not going to spend blood and treasure on grand nation-building projects as in the past.
So, in terms of like the interventions historically, how does an interventionist foreign policy benefit the average American citizen? Because
it depends on the intervention. So in World War II, the argument was that if you didn't intervene, Western Europe was going to be irrevocably Nazi and Britain would be fail. And then eventually the nexus of Italian fascism to Nazism and militarism in Japan would overwhelm the United States. So there was a self-interest in getting involved in something, and the same argument was used about World War I, to a lesser extent Korea, maybe Vietnam. Now that the Cold War is over, and now that the United States is developing a sophisticated missile defense system and has an overwhelming nuclear deterrent, there's less of an argument that the United States should go into Yemen, or the United States needs to do something about Venezuela, or we have to confront Cuba. So I think the attitude now is more of a retaliatory, don't tread on me. If somebody in Iran wants to try to blow up a carrier in the Straits of Hormuz and they do that, then I think the current policy would take out the entire Iranian air forces. They would bomb all the naval bases, but they wouldn't invade Iran. They would much less think that they could overthrow the theocracy and stay there to make a democracy. They're just not going to do that.
yeah, that seems like the more pragmatic and practical solution. It seemed like that the idea of trying to have completely radical different cultures with different histories and try to force down your idea of government without any sort of tangible benefit for the United States in terms of resources does not seem like a practical venture.
I think so. I think what really made focus on that proposition was there was a perception that globalization, that is the increase of the domestic market, the 330 million to 7 billion, benefited people in a particular economic bracket on the two coasts, people in high tech, people in international finance, people in the media, people in academia, but it did not benefit people in between. By that I mean if you had muscular labor in your job, so if you were in a mine or you were a logger or you were a machinist, then the idea was that labor could be replaced cheaper manufacturing in Mexico or Taiwan or Japan, but especially China. And so that was outsourced. So for the red interior of the United States, globalization was an impoverishment. And then people began to deprecate those because they were losers, they were deplorables, they were clingers, they were irredeemables. And so their attitude was, since I'm not doing very well at this global project, I don't feel it to support it. I'm not really worried about going in and removing Muammar Gaddafi. I really don't care what happens in Egypt. I'm not going to send my son. So the benefits, I guess what I'm saying, the benefits of globalization was in a geographical sense unfairly distributed and the cost was, well, there was a sense that the lower middle classes of the interior were doing a lot of the fighting, and they couldn't see how that fighting, even if it helped the globalization project, helped them in particular. They lost jobs in steel, aluminum, manufacturing, construction, and they didn't think that was necessarily worth dying for.
All right. Before we end the show, do you have any final things you would like to say to our audience?
Well, I think it's a very exciting time, and the Trump era is it's the most peculiar era I've ever seen. I'm 65, in which his agenda is pretty much the dreams of a Romney or McCain or even a Bob Dole campaign, whether it's tax reform or deterrence abroad or deregulation or more energy development or getting tough with China. But the Republican hierarchy is repelled by him because of his never had political experience, military, and his comportment. And on the one hand, on the other hand, we've never seen 90% of media coverage negative to a particular president. We've never seen serious efforts to evoke the emoluments clause, the 25th Amendment, impeachment writs, the Mueller investigation, assassination shit talk, she, like Madonna blowing up the White House or Johnny Depp killing the president. We've never seen that before from the left quite like that. So we've never seen a president without, as an outsider, we've never seen hostility toward him expressed by the Republican establishment and almost all of the liberal progressive movement. So, and that's not a sustainable situation. So that's going to come to a head one way or the other.
And what do you think the outcome is? Do you think it's going to result, this cold Civil War dynamic, in something more intense, or is this just going to blow off when Trump is out of office?
No, I think he's a symptom. He's not a catalyst. I think people are geographically and culturally moving apart. So I think that we have two groups of people already, and they don't interact as much. I think there's a large group of people, for a variety of reasons, they don't watch ESPN anymore. They don't know the first thing about hip-hop music. They don't want to know. They don't watch the NFL. They're tired of Take the Knee. They haven't been to a movie in years. They don't trust Hollywood. They tune out the major networks. They don't trust the media. That's about 45% of the country. And then there's another 45% who feel that American traditions are flawed and that we have a new demographic and we need more redistribution and we need more divorce from our past. America was always toxic. You've got to reinvent it, as Obama said, fundamentally transform it. And those two positions are not compatible. And we don't have people who are trying to say, how can we bridge the difference? Basically, both sides are saying they're so fundamental. One side has to lose and one side has to win. That was true of 1861. It was true in the 1920s, 30s during the Depression. So we're at the point now where one vision is going to triumph and one's not. And so far, in the Senate and the Supreme Court and the presidency, the traditionalists are winning, and then the populist left wing has taken the House. And so it just depends on how you define the conflict. If you're a left-wing person, you say, gosh, we won the university there, we control them, we control the foundations, we control Hollywood, we control network TV, we control the news organizations, we control the progressive universities, all of the universities. So if you're on the right, you'd say, well, they may do all that, but when it comes to actually running political power, we still have the Senate, Supreme Court, presidency. And that's where we are. One side's going to have to win and one side's going to have to lose.
Which side do you think ultimately wins? And
I don't know. It's hard to know. Usually the side that there's certain things, which side is having children and they're family orientated so that they're reproducing themselves, which side has a paradigm that's more conducive to stability, which side, you can make arguments to varying degrees in each side, if that is embraced, then race becomes secondary and ethnic affiliation. If it's rejected into separatism and tribalism, then who has the numbers? So far we've seen the identity politics crowd say, you know what, this is a toxic country. I'm going to identify by my hyphenated name, or that I'm black or Latino or Native American or women or gay. But what they don't understand is that the majority doesn't fit those rubrics. And if you force the majority to do the same, they have more numbers. So as speaking as a white Christian male, 65, I never conceived of myself as that. I was just an American, and my family's all integrated and racially diverse. But I've noticed that when I go to places in rural California, people who are like me superficially will say hello and feel they have a bond with me. So they're starting to create an alternate identity in reaction to identity politics. So it seems to me that if I was in a minority of the population, rather than saying all day long, white supremacy, white privilege, we're going to take over, you're dead, you're dying in numbers, when they're not, a majority is not a very wise thing to do. It's going to create a backlash. And in part, it was an economic as well as, I think, white working class backlash that propelled Trump. And we think that's over with. I don't think it is over with. So what we need to do is say everybody needs to calm down and say I'm a person and I'm Latino or I'm white or gay or I'm straight or it's second. But who I am is first. And I have more in common with people than not in common. But I don't see that happening. So I'm not optimistic. I think we have to go through a catharsis where people say, you know what? If we're going to go down that road, here's what's going to happen. It's going to get pretty scary. And then I think people say, you know what? You can't go on like that. We've got to stop that. But apparently people don't want to stop and reflect. They want to keep going.
Yeah, I agree with you in the most part. A lot of this, it's just that I think that you have the geographic lines are a lot more blurred. Even in blue California, you have a third of the state voting for President Trump in 2016.
Yeah, you do, and it's geographical within the state. So if you look at a map of California counties by the 2016 election, it's mostly red as far as geography, and it's mostly blue by population. So the coastal strip is about 25% of and the LA basin, maybe 30% of the geography, and it's got about 65% of the population. And it's bright blue. But if you look at the interior, where 70% of the geography is, and maybe 30%, you said, it's bright red. So if I live in southern Fresno County, I go up to the foothills and Prather, or I go up to Dunlap, it's 100% conservative. If I come over here where I am at Stanford, it's 100% liberal. And increasingly, those two communities have nothing in common that I can see. On every issue, abortion, guns, crime, assimilation, ethnic, I don't see any illegal immigration. I don't see any common ground. It's like two different worlds.
Well, we'll try to end this on an optimistic note. What do you think is like the thing that can happen that would better the situation in California and just the broader social tensions that is has a reasonable probability?
Yeah, I think the assimilation has to proceed. So if you were to close the border with Mexico and make immigration legal, meritocratic, diverse, and measured, so that instead of taking 500,000 people illegally from one geographical and ethnic area, you said we're going to take into California, this area, 100,000 a year, and they're going to be Nigerian doctors and South Korean optometrists and, Brazilian architects. Then they would assimilate very quickly, and because there would be so many different places and races and ethnic backgrounds, there would not be large blocks that would demand exemption. But when you take everybody from one area and they come in illegally and they're not educated at the high school level, then they need massive support, and then you have a pandering to a particular group. And if that happens, then we're going to be into a tribal warfare. But if we were to change and make immigration, as I said, much different, then we would have all different people, but they would be individuals or families, and they would intermarry and assimilate and integrate. But when you mention that to the progressive movement, they don't want that because they don't see a political edge. They think they've turned California blue on identity politics and immigration. They think they've done it. The same thing with Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico. They're eyeing Arizona and Texas. So they want open borders. They want masses of unassimilated people. They want to register them. They want to claim that they can give them entitlements. They want to claim that people who oppose them are racist and xenophobic, and therefore everybody must vote as a bloc. And so there will be people who resist that, and there's no middle ground. So closing the border would be one of the best things we could do. Ending illegal immigration and making it legal and diverse, and not as much.
All right. Well, thank you for your time.
Measure. Okay.
Victor.
Okay. Well, thank you.
And we'll air this show soon. And thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.